In the bitter January of 1884, high in the Upsaroka foothills, while other hunters tracked game through the timber-lined snow, Liam Calder was doing the unthinkable, chiseling through a frozen waterfall. He claimed there was a dry cavern behind the ice, a crystal den where the walls glowed with blue light. The village called it a hunter's lie. That winter, Liam would stake his life on that frozen curtain, turning the waterfall into a fortress that would either save him or bury him alive. Liam Calder was not a madman. He was a hunter who had spent more winters alone in the Upsaroka high country than most men could stomach, and he knew the ice better than he knew people. The frozen waterfall at Cathedral Falls was a landmark that locals avoided in winter, a towering sheet of jagged blue ice that groaned and cracked with every temperature shift. To them, it was a beautiful death trap. To Liam, it was a door. No one in Bitter Creek believed a cave could exist behind that frozen curtain, but Liam had once caught a glimpse of a hollow darkness through a crack, a space where wind moved differently. The central question that winter was not whether the cave was real. It was whether a single man, ridiculed and alone, could survive long enough to prove it. And if he failed, the ice would keep his secret forever. The discovery came by accident, as most discoveries in wild country do, not through careful planning but through a single wrong step on a frozen creek. Liam had been tracking a wounded elk through the Upsaroka foothills when the animal veered toward Cathedral Falls, a place even the elk seemed to know was dangerous in deep winter. The waterfall rose nearly 60 feet, a massive column of ice that looked like poured glass, and the frozen spray had built shelves and curtains that swallowed sound in strange ways. Liam had passed that waterfall 100 times, but on this day, as he knelt to check the elk's blood trail, he heard something that stopped him cold. Hollow air. The faint echo of a pebble he had kicked bouncing not against ice but against empty space behind it. He pressed his ear to the frozen wall near where the water had receded from the rock face. Wind moved somewhere deep inside, a sound like breathing. He spent the next 3 hours chiseling through the ice with his hunting knife and a sharpened branch, working until his hands turned white with cold. The curtain was over 4 feet thick in places, but near the eastern edge where the rock wall angled inward, a narrow crack had formed during the freeze, a seam where the ice sheet had pulled away just enough to leave a gap of blackness. When he finally broke through, he could only stare. Beyond the ice wall was a cavern vast enough that his lantern could not find the ceiling. The walls were not dull rock but crystalline formations that caught the faint blue light filtering through the frozen waterfall itself, turning the space into something that looked less like a cave and more like a drowned cathedral. The floor was dry, gravelly, swept clean by ancient water, and the air was still, insulated, nearly warm compared to the clawing wind outside. Liam stayed inside the cavern for almost an hour, running his fingers across the frozen walls, measuring the space by packing it out, testing the echoes. His dog, a half-wolf husky he had raised from a pup, sniffed at the corners, tail low, unsure. By the time Liam climbed back out into the daylight, the idea had already planted itself in his mind like a seed in frozen soil. This cave could shelter a man through the entire winter. No snow load, no wind, no driving drifts to bury a cabin. Just the frozen curtain itself acting as a wall, a window, and a secret. He returned to Bitter Creek that evening, half frozen but burning with certainty. The settlement was not a town so much as a cluster of rough-hewn buildings huddled against the basin wind, a trading post, a saloon, a smithy, and 24 cabins scattered like frozen dice. The men gathered in Cleary's saloon that night were miners, freighters, and hunters who had already spent too many hard winters on the frontier to entertain impossible fantasies. Marcus Cleary, the saloon owner, was a barrel-chested Irishman who had lost half his left hand to a trap line years earlier, and he held court behind the plank bar like a judge. When Liam walked in, still crusted with ice and mud, and announced that he'd found a dry cave behind Cathedral Falls, the laughter did not stop for nearly a full minute. "You've been breathing too much pine smoke, Calder," Cleary called out, wiping a glass with a rag. "There's no cave behind that ice. Old man Bledsoe mapped that whole creek back in '68, said it was solid rock and bad luck. Liam shook his head quietly, leaning against the bar. Bledsoe mapped it in summer when the water was running. You can't see the opening behind the flow. Only winter pulls the curtain back far enough. A trapper named Vernon Jacks, a long-faced man who had run the northern trapline for 2 decades, raised his glass. I've heard of ice caves before, but they're death traps. Ice shifts, collapses, and the cold inside would kill you faster than a blizzard. The others nodded, but Liam only looked at the lantern flame reflected in the dirty glass. "It's warmer in there than out here," he said quietly, and that was the line that made the room go silent. But it was Marcus Cleary's next words that turned a drunken joke into a challenge that would reshape the entire winter. He set down his rag and leaned both hands on the bar, fixing Liam with a cold stare. "You're so certain, then prove it. Stay in your frozen palace for the whole winter, from the first hard freeze to the thaw. And if you're still alive come spring, I'll drag my own sorry soul through that ice to see it." The room erupted again, this time with jeers and bets. Most men wagered Liam would be dead within a month. A few bet he'd crawl back to town in a week with frostbite and a broken story. No one bet on him surviving. Liam's only companion during those final days of preparation was the husky, a silent animal with pale blue eyes that seemed to understand more of his master's intentions than the people of Bitter Creek ever would. He packed dried meat, flour, salt, a small stove with iron pipe, 2 lengths of rope, a heavy lantern, extra oil, a pickaxe, and a shovel. He hauled it all on a sled up the frozen creek bed while the wind bit through the bare aspen branches above him. The entrance to the cave had frozen over again, but he chiseled it open wider this time, cutting an opening just large enough to drag his supplies inside. Then he built a low wall of ice blocks just inside the curtain, creating an airlock chamber that would trap heat without melting the fragile outer shell. The blue light through the ice was dim but constant, enough to see by, enough to live by. As the final days of January bled into an iron-hard cold that cracked trees in the night, Liam Calder sealed himself into the cavern with his dog beside him. He had left a note tacked to the saloon door, written in charcoal, "Gone to the ice. Don't look for me until spring." The townspeople shook their heads and muttered about fools and frozen corpses. And then the first true blizzard of the season rolled down from the high peaks, and the world outside the crystal den disappeared into a white screaming void. Liam stood at the ice door, listening to the storm hammer against the outer curtain, and felt the heavy weight of absolute isolation settle over him. If he had miscalculated anything, the ice would become his tomb. The first night inside the crystal den taught Liam Calder more about fear than all his years in the high country combined. The blizzard that rolled down from the peaks was not a storm so much as a continuous roar that shook the very rock around him. Outside the ice curtain, the wind screamed through Cathedral Creek's narrow gorge, and he could feel the pressure changes in his ears. But inside the cavern, the air remained still, so still that the lantern flame barely flickered. The ice curtain absorbed the wind's violence the way a thick pane of glass absorbs a fist. It shuddered, but it held. Liam sat with his back against the gravel floor, the husky curled against his legs, and watched the blue light pulsing through the frozen sheet like a heartbeat. Every few hours, he would crawl through the airlock chamber and check the inner ice wall for cracks, running his fingers along the seams. The cold was deep but stable, cold enough to keep the ice solid, yet warm enough that his breath did not freeze on his beard. That was the first dangerous lesson. Heat was not his ally. Too much warmth from the stove, and the ice would begin to sweat. Sweat meant melting, and melting meant collapse. He kept the small iron stove burning low, never more than a handful of pine knots at a time, and he placed it far from the ice curtain's base behind a low stone wall he had built from loose rock inside the cave. The smoke curled upward into the high unseen ceiling and found a crack somewhere in the ancient rock, a natural chimney that carried it away. That was the second lesson. The cave breathed. Air moved in slow, invisible currents, drawing fresh oxygen from somewhere behind the frozen waterfall. Without that, he would have suffocated within days. These discoveries came not from comfort but from a relentless caution, a hunter's habit of reading every clue the environment offered. He was not living in the cave, he was negotiating with it. By the end of the first week, a routine had formed. Mornings he would ration a cup of melted snow for water and a strip of dried elk meat for himself and the dog. He would check the ice curtain's thickness at 3 marked points, noting any changes in a small leather journal with a charcoal stick. The blue light filtering through the frozen waterfall waxed and waned with the outside daylight, giving him a sense of time even without seeing the sun. Afternoons he explored deeper into the cave, finding side chambers where crystal formations hung like frozen chandeliers, some of them delicate as spun sugar. He discovered a small underground stream that had not frozen, its water so cold it burned the throat but kept both man and dog alive. Nights were the hardest. The roar of the wind would drop suddenly, and in the silence his own thoughts became louder than any storm. The husky, whom he called Shade, became more than a companion. She became an early warning system. The dog's ears would flatten before the ice began to groan, sensing some subtle shift in air pressure that Liam could not detect. One night, during a particularly violent gust, a crack shot through the outer curtain like a gunshot, and a chunk of ice, the size of a man's chest, crashed into the airlock chamber. Liam spent the next 6 hours in complete darkness, chiseling the fallen slab into movable blocks and rebuilding the inner barrier, his hands bleeding while Shade whimpered softly in the corner. That night he learned the third lesson. The ice was alive. It expanded, contracted, shifted. He was not merely sheltering inside it. He was inside a thing that could change its mind. By the third week, Bitter Creek had largely dismissed him. Marcus Cleary had taken bets that Liam Calder would not last a month, and as the weeks passed without smoke rising from the waterfall or any other sign of life, the consensus hardened. Most assumed he had frozen to death in that fool's cave within the first few days, his body lying stiff somewhere behind the ice where no one would bother to retrieve it until spring. A few trappers passing near Cathedral Falls reported that the waterfall looked unchanged, solid and silent. No man could survive in there, Vernon Jacks declared at the saloon one evening, collecting a stack of coins from a miner who had bet on Liam's survival out of pity. But there was one person who did not share this certainty, an old Arapaho woman named Kita who lived at the edge of the settlement, trading herbs and mending clothes. She had spent her life in these mountains, and she alone refused to join the laughter. One evening she stopped Marcus Cleary on the frozen street and said something that he dismissed as superstition but later haunted him. "The ice remembers," Kita said. "It has held things inside it before. The hunter might not be dead. He might be being kept." Marcus shook his head and walked away, but the words lingered like a cold draft. Inside the cave, the crisis arrived without warning during the fourth week. The temperature outside plunged to something unspeakable, a killing cold that split trees open and froze the creek solid to its bed. The ice curtain thickened by nearly a foot in 3 days, and the blue light that had been Liam's constant companion began to dim dangerously. The thickening ice was absorbing more light than before, leaving him in a perpetual twilight. Worse, the contraction of the freezing rock face behind the cave caused a new and terrifying sound, a deep, rhythmic grinding as if the mountain itself was slowly closing its fist around him. Shade paced constantly, her nails clicking on the stone. Liam began to notice something else that quickened his pulse. The air was growing stale. The natural chimney that had carried away the smoke was no longer drawing properly, as if the extreme cold had plugged some invisible passage with frost. A headache settled behind his eyes that would not fade, and every breath felt slightly wrong, slightly thin. He was running out of air. He tried everything. He crawled through the cave to the farthest chamber, searching for another vent, finding only dead ends and glittering crystals that mocked him with their beauty. He chipped a small hole through the ice curtain near the top, hopping to create a draft, but the outside wind was too violent, blasting powdered snow directly into his face and forcing him to plug it again before he froze. The stove he had relied on was now a poisoner, its smoke lingering in the cavern instead of rising. He let the fire go out and sat in the complete darkness, the cold creeping into his bones, with only Shade's warmth against his chest. He realized then that the cave was not his sanctuary. It had been a trap all along, a slowly closing jaw of ice and stone, and he had walked into it willingly because he had been too arrogant to consider that nature could outthink him twice. But Liam Calder was not a man who surrendered to despair. In the darkness, as his lungs labored and his mind began to drift, he remembered something Keita had told him years earlier about caves in winter. Not all of them breathe from above. Some breathe from below, through cracks in the floor that connect to deeper, warmer chambers where the Earth's own heat keeps the air moving. He had explored the cave thoroughly, but never on his belly, never pressing his face to the cold stone floor. With the last of his lantern oil burning in a tiny, smoky flame, he began crawling across the gravel, holding his bare hand against the rock to feel for any whisper of moving air. Shade whined, then suddenly began digging in one corner, her claws scraping frantically. Liam crawled toward her, and there beneath a pile of loose scree he felt it, the faintest current of air, not cold but cool and clean, rising from a crack no wider than his thumb. He dug with his knife and then his bleeding fingers, widening the fissure inch by inch until a steady flow of breathable air began to fill the cavern. The dog had saved his life. The cave was breathing again and he collapsed on the floor, gasping like a drowning man pulled from deep water. When he finally lit a fresh wick in the lantern, he saw something that changed everything. The crack he had widened was not a natural fissure. The edges were too straight, too deliberate. Someone had cut this passage long ago. He was not the first human being to use this cave. Somewhere in the darkness below, an unknown predecessor had left their mark, and he was now standing on the threshold of a deeper mystery that not even the oldest stories of the territory had ever mentioned. Liam lowered the lantern into the crack, watching the flame bend toward the underground fissure as if drawn by a whisper. The air rising from below carried a scent that was strange but not foul, damp mineral, cold stone, and something else, something that reminded him of old ashes. He dug wider with the pickaxe, breaking away thin layers of limestone until the opening was large enough to squeeze through. Shade refused to follow at first, whining from the chamber above while Liam descended into the lower darkness, the lamplight casting long shadows across walls no human eye had seen for a very long time. The lower chamber was smaller than the upper cave, maybe 15 feet across, its ceiling so low he had to crouch. The walls were ribbed with flowstone that glittered in the lamplight, and at the center of the floor lay a neat circle of stones that could only be a fire ring. Beside it, a tattered bundle of rotted fur and leather that had once been a bedroll. And against the far wall, seated with its back to the stone and its legs drawn up, was a human skeleton. The bones were old, yellowed, and dry, still wrapped in the remnants of a canvas coat. A rusted trade knife lay beside one hand, and a small leather pouch had fallen into the ribcage. Liam approached slowly, not from fear of the dead but from a hunter's instinct to read the story before disturbing its evidence. The skull was turned toward the chamber's only exit, the same crack Liam had just widened, and one bony hand was extended toward it as if the man had died trying to dig his way out. The air current that had saved Liam's life had not come soon enough for this stranger. "Who were you?" Liam whispered, though the question felt heavier than the stale air. He opened the leather pouch carefully. Inside were a few pieces of flint, a broken pipe, and a folded square of oilcloth wrapped around a small journal. The pages were brittle, the handwriting faint, but the dates were still legible. November 11th, 1849, December 5th, January 2nd. The final entry was dated January 21st, 1850. The words were cramped and desperate. Ice closing. Can't dig fast enough. God forgive me. Below that, in a shakier hand, name is Calvin Stokes, Pennsylvania, tell my brother. Liam sat with the journal for a long time, reading every word. Calvin Stokes had been a fur trapper who had stumbled upon the cave the same way Liam had, through a crack in the frozen waterfall. He had survived for nearly 3 months, long enough to map the chambers and identify the same breathing vents Liam had discovered. But he had made a fatal mistake. He had built his fire too close to the ice curtain, melting the inner wall enough to trigger a slow collapse that sealed the entrance. He had tried to dig an escape route through the floor, following the air current, but he had died of exhaustion and suffocation before reaching the surface. Now, Liam understood the true stakes of his gamble. The cave was not merely dangerous. It had already claimed one life, and the exact same trap was still set for him. He climbed back up to the upper chamber, his mind racing. Calvin's journal contained more than a cautionary tale. It contained a detailed diagram of the cave's ventilation system, including a second vent that Calvin had discovered near the rear chamber but never had the strength to reach. If Liam could find that vent, he could establish a reliable airflow that would not depend on the fragile floor fissure. The dead man was offering him a map to survival. The days that followed were consumed by excavation. Liam followed Calvin's sketch directions to a narrow crawlspace behind a column of flowstone, where a vertical shaft rose into darkness. He could feel the air moving there, stronger than anywhere else in the cave, and he began the agonizing work of widening the passage with his pickaxe and bleeding hands. Each swing echoed through the cavern like a hammer on an anvil. Shade lay nearby, watching, occasionally tilting her head at sounds only she could hear. And gradually, hour by hour, the vent opened wider, and the cave began to breathe with a steady, clean draft that carried the smoke away without a trace. But the work came at a cost. His food supplies were dwindling faster than he had calculated. The dried elk meat was nearly gone. The flour was running low. He had not anticipated the sheer physical toll of digging through frozen limestone, and his body was consuming energy faster than the rations could replace. He began rationing himself to one meal a day, then half a meal, and Shade's ribs began to show beneath her thick fur. The cave was protecting him from the storm, but starvation was becoming a quieter, more patient enemy. Meanwhile, outside in Bitter Creek, events were stirring that would soon collide with Liam's fragile survival. A freighter named Eli Dawson, hauling supplies from the railhead at Miles City, had taken a shortcut past Cathedral Falls during a brief lull in the weather. He noticed something strange, a faint gray wisp rising from behind the frozen waterfall, too thin to be a bonfire but too steady to be mist, smoke. He reported it at Cleary's saloon that night, and the room fell into heated debate. "It's just steam from the creek," Marcus Cleary insisted. "Water runs under the ice sometimes." But Vernon Jacks, the trapper, shook his head. "Steam doesn't hold shape like smoke. Something's burning in there." The argument ended with a new round of bets and a growing unease that perhaps Liam Calder was not as dead as everyone had assumed. Keita, the old Arapaho woman, heard the news without surprise. She sat on the porch of her small cabin, weaving willow strips into a basket, and when a neighbor asked her what she thought, she only said, "The ice does not kill what it chooses to hold." She had lived long enough to know that the mountains kept their own secrets, and that sometimes those secrets were not malevolent. They were simply old. Inside the cave, Liam was beginning to understand the same truth. Calvin Stokes had not been the first human to enter this cave either. Buried deeper in the journal were fragmentary notes about markings on the walls that Calvin had found but could not decipher. "I found scratches on the stone near the rear vent," Calvin had written. "Not like animal marks, like something else, maybe older folk." Liam crawled to the rear chamber with the lantern and held it close to the wall. There they were, faint, worn by time and moisture but unmistakable, pictographs. A line of stick-figure hunters carrying spears, a circle that might have been the sun or moon, and at the center a drawing that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, a waterfall with a hollow space behind it and a figure standing inside. The cave was not merely a geological accident. It was a place that had been known, used, perhaps even revered by the people who lived in these mountains long before the first trappers arrived. And that knowledge reframed everything Liam thought he understood about his predicament. He was not a pioneer. He was the latest in a line of survivors who had found shelter behind this frozen curtain, stretching back into a past so deep that even the stories had been forgotten. The spiritual weight of that realization settled over him like a second silence. He began to notice things he had overlooked before. The way the blue light through the ice created patterns on the walls that shifted with the sun, the cathedral-like hush that filled the chamber, the almost intentional arrangement of the crystal formations around the central space. The cave was not just a shelter. It was a sanctuary, and it had been waiting. But winter had not finished testing him. In the final week of February, a sudden warm spell rolled into the Upsaroka foothills, the temperature rising 30 degrees in a single afternoon. Outside, the frozen creek began to melt in places, sending trickles of water down the ice curtain. Inside, the cavern started to sweat. Drops fell from the ceiling like a slow, cold rain, and the ice wall began to thin alarmingly. The blue light grew brighter, almost blinding, as the curtain lost its opacity. Liam knew what this meant. If the thaw continued, the waterfall would collapse entirely and the cave would flood. He had maybe a week, perhaps less, before the entrance became impassable. The winter that had been his prison might soon become his flood. He packed Calvin Stokes's journal into his coat, gathered what little remained of his supplies, and prepared to leave. But not to Bitter Creek. Not yet. He remembered Marcus Cleary's challenge. "I'll drag my own sorry soul through that ice to see it." And he realized that the only way to silence the skeptics was not to emerge and tell his story, but to bring them inside. The window was closing, but it was still open. And if he could lead the most vocal doubters through the frozen passage before the ice collapsed, he would not merely prove he had survived. He would ensure that the crystal den became a legend that would outlive him. The storm had built him a fortress. Now it was time to show the world what lay inside. The morning Liam Calder walked back into Bitter Creek, the settlement had almost forgotten him. He emerged from the frozen timberline on foot, his clothes hanging loose on his bones, his face hollowed by months of darkness and rations measured to crumbs. Shade moved alongside him, gaunt but alert, her pale eyes scanning the cabins as if the town itself were foreign territory. It was the first week of March, and the thaw was already gnawing at the edges of the snowpack. Water dripped from every eave, and the streets had turned to mud that sucked at boots. The first person to see him was Vernon Jacks. The old trapper was loading pelts onto a wagon and froze mid-motion, a beaver skin dangling from his fist. He stared at Liam for a long moment, then shook his head slowly, not with mockery, but with the disbelief of a man watching a ghost. "You're supposed to be dead," Vernon said. Liam stopped in the street, squinting against the pale daylight that felt like needles after so many weeks in twilight. "I was," he said, "but the ice decided otherwise." Word spread faster than fire. Doors swung open. Faces appeared at windows. By the time Liam reached Cleary's saloon, a crowd had gathered behind him, murmuring, pointing. Marcus Cleary was standing on the plank porch with his arms crossed, but his expression was not the smug certainty Liam remembered. It was wary, unsettled. The saloon owner had collected a lot of money betting that Liam would die, and now the dead man was standing in front of him, breathing. "You got something to say?" Marcus asked, his voice quieter than usual. Liam pulled Calvin Stokes's journal from inside his coat and held it up. "I found a dead man in that cave, trapper from 1850. He left me a map, and he left me his story." The crowd hushed. Liam raised his voice just enough to carry to the back of the gathering. "I told you there was a cavern behind the frozen waterfall. Now I'm telling you it's bigger than I thought. It's been sheltering men for longer than any of us have been alive. And before the ice melts and the entrance floods forever, I'm going to show you. But you have to come now, today." Marcus stared at the journal, then at Liam's emaciated face, and something shifted behind his eyes. It was no longer pride or mockery. It was curiosity, the same painful curiosity that had driven Liam to chisel through that ice wall 4 months earlier. "All right," Marcus said reluctantly. "I'll see it." The party that assembled that afternoon was small. Marcus Cleary, Vernon Jacks, the freighter Eli Dawson, and a young miner named Tom Harrow who had been among the loudest skeptics. Keita, the Arapaho woman, watched from her porch as they rode out of town. She said nothing, but her eyes followed them until the timberline swallowed them whole. The trail to Cathedral Falls had softened in the thaw, the snow turning to slush that hid treacherous ice beneath. The creek was running high, its surface breaking through the frozen crust in places, and the sound of rushing water filled the gorge. When they reached the waterfall, the men dismounted slowly, staring at the massive ice curtain that still clung to the cliff face. The blue light shining through it was almost blinding now, and water dripped steadily from its edge, carving runnels in the snow below. "It's melting," Eli said nervously. "The whole thing could come down while we're in there." Liam was already kneeling at the entrance he had dug 4 months earlier. The airlock wall he had built from ice blocks had partially melted, but the inner curtain was still intact, a dark gap just wide enough for a man to crawl through. "Then we better move fast," he said, and without waiting for agreement, he got on his hands and knees and disappeared into the darkness. One by one, the others followed. Marcus went second, his bulk scraping against the ice, cursing under his breath. Vernon carried a lantern. Eli trembled. Tom Harrow tried to make a joke, but his voice came out thin and hollow. Inside the airlock, Liam stood waiting, his own lantern raised high, and when the last man had crawled through, he turned and led them deeper into the cavern. The moment they entered the central chamber, all talking stopped. The blue light filtering through the frozen waterfall filled the space with an otherworldly glow, turning the crystal formations on the walls into cascading curtains of frozen light. The ceiling rose 50 feet above them, lost in shadows that swallowed sound. The floor was dry gravel, swept clean by centuries of drafts, and the air was perfectly still, faintly warm, insulated from the roaring meltwater outside as if the cave were holding its breath. "Lord Almighty," Vernon whispered, and those were the first words spoken. Marcus Cleary stood motionless, his lamp lowered, his mouth slightly open. He had built his entire reputation on knowing the land, on dismissing what was not possible. Now he was standing inside the impossible. Liam walked them through the chambers quietly, showing them the fire ring he had used, the vent Calvin Stokes had diagrammed, the hidden crawlspace that led to the rear shaft. He showed them the lower chamber where the skeleton still sat against the wall, and he handed Calvin's journal to Vernon, who read the final entry aloud with a voice that cracked. "Ice closing. Can't dig fast enough. God forgive me." The words hung in the cold air like smoke. Then Liam led them to the rear wall and raised his lantern. The ancient pictographs glowed faintly in the light. The hunters, the circle, the waterfall with the hollow space behind it. And at the center, the figure standing inside, arms spread wide as if in welcome or warning. "This cave was known to people who were here long before any trapper ever crossed these mountains," Liam said quietly. "I'm just the latest one to find it, and probably not the last." Marcus Cleary put one weathered hand against the stone beside the pictographs. He did not speak for a long while. When he finally did, his voice was stripped of all its earlier mockery. "You were right, Calder. This ain't a cave, it's a cathedral." The word stuck. Vernon repeated it under his breath. Eli Dawson, who had never been much for religion, took off his hat. The ice groaned somewhere above them, a deep shudder that vibrated through the walls. It was time to leave. Liam led them back through the chambers, past the skeleton that would remain there for another spring, and into the fatting daylight. One by one they crawled out of the ice tunnel, their clothes wet, their faces changed. The afternoon had turned cold again, the sun sinking behind the peaks, but no one complained about the chill. They were too busy trying to explain what they had just seen. The ride back to Bitter Creek was nearly silent. Only when the lights of the settlement appeared through the trees did someone speak. It was Tom Harrow, the young miner who had been so eager to mock. "They're gonna have to put this on a map," he said, and he was right. Within a week, the story had spread beyond Bitter Creek. The Bitter Creek Gazette ran a front-page piece in its March 28th edition, under the headline, "The Crystal Den, a Hunter's Discovery, ASTOUNDS the Basin." The article described the cave in meticulous detail, quoting Marcus Cleary calling it a natural cathedral of ice and stone. It mentioned the skeleton of Calvin Stokes and the pictographs, and it ended with a single line that secured Liam Calder's place in the territory's history. The cavern, now known as Calder's Ice Den, is expected to appear on all future territorial maps. True to that prediction, the 1886 Montana Territorial Survey included the feature, marked as Calder's Ice Den, at the base of Cathedral Falls. The crystal cave that no one had believed existed was now officially a landmark. But the story did not end with the mapping. The following summer, a party of geologists from the territorial capital visited the site, discovering that the cave's unique insulation was due to a geothermal vent deep beneath the mountain, the same vent that had kept the air flowing and the temperature surprisingly stable. The ice curtain, they reported, was not merely a freak of weather but a recurring formation that had sealed the cave every winter for centuries, preserving it and protecting anything inside. And the ancient pictographs, which were eventually documented by a visiting ethnographer in 1891, were identified as belonging to the mountain Shoshone, who had used the cave as a winter ceremonial site for generations. The figure standing inside the waterfall, the ethnographer wrote, was not a warning. It was a blessing, a symbol of the shelter that the earth provides to those who listen to its rhythms. Liam Calder did not seek fame. He stayed in Bitter Creek for several more years, hunting and trapping, occasionally guiding curious visitors to the ice den in early winter before the passage sealed. He never charged for the tour. He simply wanted people to see, to understand that nature sometimes hides its greatest gifts behind the most forbidding faces. Calvin Stokes's journal he kept in a locked chest in his cabin, and on the anniversary of his own discovery, he would take it out and read the final entry, always pausing at the line, "Tell my brother." He never learned if Calvin had a brother who received the message, but he wrote a letter to every Stokes in Pennsylvania he could find, and one of them, a nephew, eventually replied. The last surprise came years later, long after the cave had become a memory that some dismissed as exaggerated folklore. In 1927, a writer for Western Outdoors magazine retraced Liam's journey, interviewing the few surviving witnesses from that spring day. Vernon Jacks, then an old man in his 80s, told the writer, "I've seen a lot of things in these mountains. Nothing prepared me for that light. It was like walking into a frozen rainbow." Marcus Cleary had died years earlier, but his daughter remembered him talking about the cathedral until his final days. The cave itself, however, was no longer accessible. A rockfall in 1903 had sealed the entrance permanently, burying the ice curtain and the chambers behind tons of stone. The waterfall still froze every winter, but the passage was gone. The crystal den had returned to being a secret, just as it had been for countless winters before Liam Calder ever set foot in the Absaroka foothills. And that perhaps was the most fitting ending of all. The cave had not been conquered. It had simply been borrowed for a time, then taken back. The story of Liam Calder and the Crystal Den survived long after the cave itself vanished beneath tons of stone. It was passed from old trappers to young hunters around winter fires, from mothers to children during blizzards that rattled cabin walls, and eventually into the sparse written records of a territory that was still learning its own shape. What makes this story endure is not merely the strangeness of a cavern hidden behind a frozen waterfall, though that image is unforgettable on its own. It is the deeper question embedded in every telling. Why do we dismiss the things we cannot immediately see? The people of Bitter Creek laughed at Liam Calder because his claim defied their common sense. A dry cave behind a waterfall in winter. Preposterous. And yet the cave had been there for centuries, waiting. It had sheltered mountain people whose names are lost to time. It had held the bones of a desperate trapper, and it had opened its blue-lit chambers to a stubborn hunter who refused to accept the limits of other men's imaginations. The frontier was full of such stories, stories of things that could not exist until someone stumbled into them and proved they had been there all along. But perhaps the more unsettling reflection is this: the cave is gone now. The entrance that Liam Calder chiseled open, the cathedral that Marcus Cleary could not describe without reaching for the language of faith, the pictographs that connected those chambers to a human history far older than the settlement itself, all of it now lies buried beneath a rockfall that no one witnessed. What else, in the wild places we think we know, remains hidden behind ice or stone or simple disbelief? And what would it take for someone like you to be the one who finally looks? If a story like this reaches you, it means you are already listening for the things others dismiss. Subscribe now and stay with us for the next journey into the forgotten corners of history, where the line between myth and truth remains razor thin. Until then, remember, Sometimes the coldest walls hold the warmest secrets.